Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor. And it's Wednesday, which means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain graphic novel, comic book, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about the same graphic novel, comic book, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, we've got kind of an interesting one. We're going to be talking about Marvel Comics' Kull. Kull, the character that was created by Robert E. Howard, who also created Conan the Barbarian. You might have heard of that guy. And they also printed Kull comic books. Kull was a character created by Robert E. Howard before Robert E. Howard created Conan. And Robert E. Howard did not write a ton of Kull stories, but everything that Robert E. Howard did write about Kull could be found in this one relatively slim volume. This is Kull, Exile of Atlantis, an excellent volume which I highly recommend if you're interested in fantasy at all, particularly if you're interested in Robert E. Howard's work. It's essential if you're interested in Robert E. Howard to check out these stories. So, yeah. I've talked quite a bit about Kull on my channel. But Marvel Comics did print Kull comic books because during the 70s, Conan was a big hit. And so they were looking around for another fantasy character that they could make comics about. And why not do more Robert E. Howard comics because they were so popular? So Kull seemed like the obvious choice. Kull was Robert E. Howard's other fantasy character. Kull, who was from Atlantis in the pre-cataclysmic age. The pre-cataclysmic age was way before even Conan's Hyborian age. So this is a long time ago when Kull was around. And Kull was from Atlantis. Now, it's not the super scientifically advanced Atlantis we sometimes think of. This was a savage place full of barbarians, and Kull was a barbarian. He was exiled from his tribe for showing an enemy mercy. And after some various adventures that we never get to see too much in the Robert E. Howard stories, he makes his way to Valusia, a great kingdom, where he becomes a mercenary. Eventually, he gains power and usurps the throne and makes himself king. So he becomes king by his own hand, much like Conan does. However, Kull and Conan are two very different characters, which is very apparent if you read the stories that Robert E. Howard originally wrote. Kull was a darker character. He was a more brooding character. He was a barbarian. Interestingly, in Robert E. Howard's stories, he wasn't interested in women at all. That just wasn't his thing. Romance, no. Fighting, yes. And while you got the idea that he was a good and honest king, he never strikes one as savagely intelligent the way that Conan is. Conan seemed much more competent as a general, warrior, and king, I think, than Kull did, at least to me. But Kull is a big, tough, strong guy with a streak of decency in him. He's a decent character, despite being, a barbarian who goes into red rages, so also somebody you want to be careful with. He's an interesting character, and there are Robert E. Howard fans who prefer the character of Kull over Conan. And so he seemed like an obvious choice to do comics about, and Marvel did make a lot of comics about Kull. Not nearly as many comics as they made off of Conan, because Kull was never as popular as Conan was. And I think there were some reasons for that, which we'll talk a little bit about. So Marvel Comics, a few years ago, got the rights to Conan and the other Robert E. Howard properties back from Dark Horse. Dark Horse Comics had the Conan license for quite a while. And they did their own Conan comic books. They did their own Kull comic books. But Marvel got those rights back. And since then, they came out with a new Conan comic book, of course. But where they've really been making their money is where they really make their money now, which is in reprint volumes. And so they've been pumping out Conan reprint volumes at a pretty quick rate. They've been coming out really fast for Marvel. Marvel usually spaces out their epic collections and their omnibus volumes. But the Conan stuff is it's just been coming out quickly. I suspect this is because they never intended to keep this license very long. I think they got the license back for a few years, enough time to just reprint all of this old stuff that they had lying around so they can make some money off it. Which is, a smart move. And so we've gotten a ton of Conan omnibus volumes, which I've been happily collecting. And they've come out with 3 Kull omnibus volumes. They haven't come out with any epic collections for Kull that I'm aware of, and I think I'd be aware of them. But they have come out with 3 omnibus volumes, which reprint all of the Kull stuff that was printed in the 70s and 80s. So we've got Kull the Destroyer here. This is the Kull the Destroyer omnibus, which collects all of the Kull comic books that were printed during the 1970s and possibly into the 80s. How late does this stuff go? Definitely during the 70s, all of that. All the initial Conan color comic books. Now, Kull was also printed in black and white for backup features in the Savage Sword of Conan, which was Marvel's black and white Conan magazine. And there was a short-lived series called Kull and the Barbarians. And so this volume, this is Kull the Savage. This reprints all of the black and white Kull comic books. So all of that stuff is reprinted in this one omnibus volume. There was some remaining Kull stuff because Kull's color comic book came back in the 1980s after it had been canceled. And it came back in a really good run of Kull comics. It was short-lived, but of high quality, I think. And so everything there is in Kull the Conqueror. So it's a shorter omnibus, which has all of that 1980s stuff, including a standalone graphic novel that was printed about Kull. That's in here as well. So they reprinted all of their Kull stuff in these omnibus volumes, which is amazing because up until this point, the Kull comic books were really, really hard to get. And the only way you can get them is by kind of scouring the back issue bins. Dark Horse did reprint Kull comic books when they had the license. They did reprint some of the older Marvel comic books. But even that stuff became kind of hard to get. That stuff became collectible pretty quickly. In fact, I don't think I ever saw too much of it. It all kind of went so fast. But now we've got these omnibus volumes. And that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to be talking about this initial Kull series. When Marvel decided to print Kull comic books, they did make a few changes to the character, the most noticeable being that he was suddenly interested in women, which he just wasn't in the original stories. It makes sense that he would be. Add some romance. And heaven forbid that anybody think Kull was gay. We just can't have that. That would just be terrible. And it wouldn't be true to the character anyway. The character just wasn't interested in romance of any kind. He just didn't care. He just wanted to be king and fight. So that was Kull. But they did make him interested in that kind of thing a bit more in the comic books, which, like I said, kind of makes sense. Initially, when they first did their first Kull comic book, it didn't show up in Kull didn't show up in his own comic book. He showed up in one of my favorite comics from the 70s, which I unabashedly loved, which was Creatures on the Loose. And here's the cover to the Kull issue of Creatures on the Loose. Creatures on the Loose reprinted a bunch of old monster comics and some other stuff. They did do a great Gulliver of Mars series that I wish would be reprinted. But they also, that's where King Kull first showed up. Interestingly, the first artist was Bernie Wrightson. The script was Roy Thomas, so you know the script was top-notch. Roy Thomas does great work. He did the Conan comic book for over 100 issues, I believe. And he also did this initial Kull story. However, Bernie Wrightson, whom I love as one of the greatest horror artists of all time in comics or outside of comics, didn't do a stellar job, I don't think. I just don't think he was right for Kull. And so the art on this initial story is just kind of, didn't really work for me. But Kull eventually got his own comic book. And the initial series of stories in his own comic book, there is the cover of the first issue of Kull the Conqueror. And the artwork was done by, in this initial issue, by Ross Andrew, and Wally Wood did the inks. Roy Thomas did the script, and it was great. Wally Wood, first of all, you put Wally Wood on anybody, Wally Wood can make anybody look good. And he does a great job on Andrew's artwork. And so we've got a really interesting version of Kull who looks quite a bit different than Conan did. We've got Brule the Spear Slayer, the character that becomes Kull's best friend. And we just get a really excellent initial issue. Excuse my terrible dog. I have the worst dog. Shut up! Did it work? I probably didn't work. Let me continue to talk about Kull and ignore Rhonda. So that was the first issue. The second issue is when it gets really good, because the second issue is when we get, Roy Thomas is still writing the comic, so you know the script is still real good, but we get Marie and John Severn as artists. So I am a huge Marie Severn fan. I love Marie Severn's work. This is her initial splash page for her first Kull story. It's just fantastic. Look at Kull there. Maybe I do like women after all. So, and she just does a excellent version. Her version of Kull is just great. She has just such a classic style. Just this beautiful illustrative style. She's just so good. And she doesn't get nearly as much praise as she deserves as a comic book artist. She's just so damn good. And these initial stories of Kull are just incredible. The stories are great. The artwork is just fantastic by the Severns. And this initial story adapts the Shadow Kingdom, which is one of the greatest Robert E. Howard Kull stories. And you can see there that where he's fighting the evil, sneaky serpent people. And Marie Severn goes on to do many of these initial Kull stories. But of course, it just couldn't last, you know. But the initial stories that she did were just great. Eventually, Gary Conway starts doing the scripting. And Conway, to Conway's credit, does a really good job, I thought. Kull was an interesting character to do, very different from Conan, in that all the Kull stories, or at least most of them at least, except for the ones that are in flashback, take place when Kull is a king. It's about King Kull, Kull as king. Whereas Conan his story spanned his career. And a lot of the Conan stories took place before he was king. But because Kull, his stories are all about when he was king, you get a bunch of recurring characters. And you get to know these recurring characters a bit better in the comic book than you actually do in the initial run of stories. Brule, of course, is a very important character, but you also get to know a lot of the other characters a bit better than you otherwise would, including some characters that were just kind of made up for the comic book. Now, eventually, Maurice Severin left and was replaced, oddly enough, by Mike Ploog. Mike Ploog, who I really like in horror comic books. I don't like Mike Ploog on Kull. He's not bad. He's not a bad artist at all. He's just wrong for this book, I think. He is a good fantasy artist, but it has to be the right kind of fantasy. And this, I don't think, is quite right for Ploog. It's not terrible. I just don't think it really fits. And I don't think it really helped the comic book. Another thing that did not help is that at this point, every issue, it seemed like, had a different inker. And that was possibly because they were just, at that point, getting whoever they can get to ink these comics. It could be they were looking for somebody to make Ploog's artwork work on Kull. It could be because Kull was not a comic book that was a priority to Marvel. Eventually, I think Ploog only lasted about 4 issues, and he was replaced by Ed Hannigan and was it Ernie Chow who did some later stuff? Yeah, Ernie Chan. And Ernie Chan does some good work. Again, we have a situation towards the end of this run of comics where you just have a different inker every issue, which did not help. Around the same time that those color comic books were coming out, you had a bunch of the comic books show up in black and white. In Kull and the Barbarians, which was only 4 issue, I think it was 4 issues. And you also had a lot of backup features in Savage Sword of Conan. The quality varied. A lot of it was pretty good. Just give you a little taste there. I won't go through all of it because I don't want this video to last forever. But I did want to mention one Conan artist in particular, and this actually showed up in Bizarre Adventures, which was a black and white Marvel comic where they just had, it was like an anthology thing. They just had different characters headlining every issue or every couple issues. And this one had Kull. And the artist on this was John Bolton. Yeah, John Bolton was the artist. And he is magnificent. And he just did a beautiful, beautiful job on this comic. I mean, this was such a beautiful issue. And John Bolton did come back to Kull. See, a little bit more interested there. Kull. Just absolutely magnificent work from that one issue of Bizarre Adventures. By far the best thing in the black and white stuff. There was a lot of good black and white stuff. Again, at the end though, some of the later Kull stuff, the artwork just doesn't really hold up, I don't think. Even though there were some really good artists, they were kind of mixed up with some artists that, maybe it wasn't so great. But definitely a lot of stuff worth reading in the black and white stuff. But where Kull really got good again is when Kull made his return in the late 80s with the stuff you'll find in here in Kull the Conqueror. Because well, first of all, you got a couple really bad issues of Marvel Team Up, which show up in here and I guess kind of heralded the return of King Kull. So you get a couple bad issues of Marvel Team Up. This one's particularly bad. Spider-Man and King Kull are 2 characters that should never meet under any circumstances. But they do. They meet. And who did they get to do the penciling? Well, our good friend Herb Trimpe. Steve Donoghue's favorite artist, Herb Trimpe. And you can see why he's Steve Donoghue's favorite artist, because he's just so great, Herb Trimpe. So you've got a bunch of Herb Trimpe artwork where Kull is meeting Spider-Man. Just something that shouldn't happen, and it does. But after that, you get this beautiful thing. Look at that. This run of Kull comics was really good. It was really good. Alan Zelenitz did the script, but John Buscema did a lot of the artwork in this series, and John Bolton did a lot of the artwork in this series. So you've got two great artists working on this comic book. And even though it was not a comic book that lasted terribly long, it just had some, I mean, it had some great stuff. Look at that Bolton artwork. What is this thing? Look at this creature. This is about the most terrifying werewolf thing I've ever seen. And you can find it in this King Kull omnibus. Just great stuff. The artwork from John Buscema is just magnificent. So this is actually a particularly good omnibus with this later Kull stuff. The scripts were really entertaining, and the artwork was just great. Here we've got John Buscema with Claus Johnson on inks, which produces a really interesting effect. Good stuff. I'll shut up now. I've been going on for 20 minutes. But I should say that as far as being a success, Kull really wasn't. I think fans liked Kull, but he was never the success that Conan was. And I'm thinking that might be because as a character, Kull was a bit more limited, or quite a bit more limited, than Conan was. Conan, well, first of all, Conan's personality is more fun. Conan just is more fun to hang out with. As a reading experience, Conan is just, he's a very entertaining character who's got more nuance to him. And you can tell so many more stories about Conan than you can about Kull, because you could follow Conan's career at any point in the comic book. And so you have more variety in the Conan comics. Whereas Kull, it's all about him being king. So you're going to have a more limited focus on the Kull stories. Perhaps that's one of the reasons he became less popular, or was less popular. Even though he was a big barbarian, he seemed a bit less barbaric than Conan, while at the same time, he did seem a bit less intelligent than Conan did. There were probably a bunch of reasons why Kull was not as popular as Conan and less successful than Conan. At the same time, a lot of these comics are really good. Unfortunately, in the original run of the Kull comics, after the Marie Severin issues, the quality really goes up and down. Again, there were some artistic choices which I don't think worked. I don't think having a different inker every issue particularly helped that comic. There were probably a lot of reasons that Kull kind of folded, that initial run of issues did. But he was a strong character, Kull. And they did some great comics, particularly that last run I was talking about. I really liked those comics. So if you have a chance, or if you're able to pick this stuff up, do it while you can. I don't know how expensive these are because I didn't check, but if they're still priced reasonably, get them now, because they will not be reprinted. Marvel will lose the rights to Conan and Kull probably soon, and that means this is it, probably for a while. This is the only way you're going to enjoy these comics, and unless you buy back issues. And these comics are really enjoyable. Great fantasy comics. So that's all I have to say for today. Check out Steve Donoghue's channel. It'll be interesting to hear his thoughts on Kull. I don't think I've ever heard him talk about the Kull issues before. So that'll be fun. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.